Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about modeling within-person emotion regulation processes using person-specific networks. My name is Xiao Yang. I'm currently a postdoc researcher in the Department of Psychology at Stanford University. So before I go into the details of how to model within-person emotion regulation processes, I want to talk a little bit about why modeling psychological networks. When I started grad school, I studied developmental psychology, and there was one developmental theory that was very intriguing for me. It says individual functioning is a product of numerous dynamic processes that span multiple domains of functioning and across multiple time scales. I know it sounds very abstract at this level, so I want to give you a more intuitive explanation. You might have seen or heard of this movie called Inside Out. In this movie, there are 5 different emotions inside of a teenage girl, Riley, and the 5 emotions talk to each other and influence each other's emotion, and that'll emerge on Riley's person level as discrete emotions. And this emotion also motivate Riley to engage with different kinds of social behaviors, and such social behaviors will in turn affect Riley's emotions. So what I'm trying to convey here is that emotions and social behaviors are 2 different domains and they interact with each other, and it improves where it affects individual functioning. So as a methodologist, my mind naturally goes to the methodology questions. I ask myself, can I model individual functioning as an interconnected network of multiple domains, such as emotions, behaviors, or thoughts? And once I have this network modeled, I can represent it as the faster timescale dynamics. Is that associated with slower timescale developmental outcomes? So with those 2 questions, I started building this research line where I used dynamical system-based psychological networks to explain emotion regulation and use the network structure to explain consequences of emotion regulation or emotion dysregulation in terms of mental health outcomes. So before I go into the details of the modeling, I want to give you a brief overview of the roadmap of this computational pipeline, as well as some brief definitions of the terminologies. So when you hear networks, you have to know that networks have nodes and edges, and the nodes in psychological networks are psychological variables. It could be emotions, could be cognition, or physiology or behavior. The edges I work with are temporal relations. Temporal relations simply mean how variables influence each other across time points. For example, how I feel today is influenced by how I felt yesterday. So the 2 feelings of mine have a temporal lag between them, and there are temporal influence from yesterday to today. So I usually use time series data and dynamical system methods to model such temporal relations. And the time series data could be ecological momentary assessment data or EMA data. It could be physiological arousal data or fMRI data, or even more novel data types. And with dynamical system models, we can model the temporal relations or estimate the temporal relations and then depict them as a network, as this. And then the fun part is to combine it with impulse response analysis, which is an in silico experiment to understand how the network functions when it's stressed. Particularly, we can perturb one of the nodes and then observe how this node will change its value across the time course. And then we can create network metrics to measure how far away the node has deviated from its original starting point to talk about emotion regulation. And this kind of network metric can then be linked to person level outcomes such as anxiety or depression to be able to find evidence empirically to link short-term emotion regulation dynamics to long-term mental health outcomes. So now we understand the roadmap of this computational technique. We're ready to go into the study. In this study, I focused on adolescents' emotion networks and their linkage to anxiety. I was interested in adolescents' mental health because this is this is the developmental stage where individuals experience increasing onset of psychopathology, especially for anxiety and depression. And that's related to challenges in emotion processing. When I talk about emotion processing, I have to mention that the emotion system is often considered a multi-component system that consists of physiological response, cognitive experience, and behavioral expression. And there are distinct dynamical patterns theorized among those multiple components. For example, the emotion regulating dynamic has been theorized as an inhibitory negative feedback loop. And on the other hand, the emotion generating dynamics, or sometimes called emotion concordance, has been theorized as mutually amplifying positive feedback loop. However, in previous analysis, this kind of within-person process is often analyzed using between-person analysis, where the multiple components are not analyzed holistically as a system, but using pairwise correlational analysis to analyze them as pairs. So my question were, how do I model the within-person dynamics of multiple components simultaneously as a network? And once I have the network, how can I interpret the network in a meaningful way? In order to answer those two questions, I have to have intensive longitudinal data or time series data. In this adolescent sample, the adolescents were given a 3-minute stress-inducing task. Specifically, they were asked to give a public speech, very much like what I'm doing right now, except that I don't actually have audience right now. And the adolescents had audience, but the audience were not allowed to give them any feedback. So you could imagine the adolescents would feel some level of nervousness when they're giving this public speech. And ideally, we would also think this is an emotion regulation task, because we would expect the adolescents to be able to regulate such kind of stress in their daily lives and be able to perform a normal task, such as giving public speech. And during this 3 minutes, there are 3 second-by-second data streams measured or derived later on. The first data stream is skin conductance level, or SCL, which represents the sympathetic nervous system activity. To put an overly simplistic view of the simplistic definition or explanation of the sympathetic nervous system so that you can understand it quickly, is that the sympathetic nervous system is in charge of the fight or flight kind of response. So when humans face threatening situations, their sympathetic nervous system will be activated and prepare them to react to such kind of dangerous situations. The second data stream is respiratory sinus arrhythmia, RSA, which represents the parasympathetic system activity. And the parasympathetic nervous system is in charge of digestion, relaxation, or maintaining homeostasis. The third data stream is self-rated distress, and that's recorded by taking a video of the adolescents and have them rate their own distress second by second using a joystick when they're looking back at their video. So to summarize, we have 3 second-by-second data streams that represent the cognitive experience and physiological response in the emotion system. And we're going to discover how those 3 components interact with each other and compose this whole emotion system. And beyond that, we also have a trait level anxiety to measure the mental health outcome. Our hypothesis in this study is that we would expect emotion regulating dynamics, which is modeled based on the 3 data streams, should be associated with lower level of anxiety. Because as I mentioned, we would ideally expect adolescents to have emotion regulating skills and emotion regulating dynamics so that they can perform well in such kind of task. And if they do have emotion regulating dynamics, then we would expect them to have lower level of anxiety. On the other hand, if the adolescents have emotion generating dynamics, and they're expected to have higher level of anxiety because they are more nervous than those who have emotion regulating dynamics. So with that hypothesis in your mind, we're going into the details of the modeling. Before I go to the details, I have to mention the data pre-processing. For the dynamical system model to work, I have to organize the data into a stationary form. So in physiological data, the physiological response are usually non-stationary, which simply means the mean or standard deviation is changing over time. So non-stationary means the mean level or the standard deviation of a variable will change over time. So for example, in this participant data, the skin conductance level declines from the beginning of the task to almost the end of the task. And this kind of decline could be viewed as non-stationary data. So in order for the model to work, I converted the raw data into the difference score data. So basically taking the difference between 2 seconds to reorganize the data so that the mean and standard deviation will keep the same over the course of the task. And the 3 variables are converted to delta SEL, delta RSA, and delta distress. And I will model based on those 3 variables. The model I'm using to construct person-specific networks is called USEM, or Unified Structural Equation Modeling. Traditionally, there are 2 types of models to model temporal relations. The first is structural equation modeling, which models the contemporaneous relations. And contemporaneous simply means how variables affect each other within the same time point or within the same measurement. The second type of model is called vector autoregression model, or VAR model, which models the Lagrange relations. And the Lagrange relations mean how variables influence each other from t-1 to t. And USEM combines those 2 together and estimate the contemporaneous and Lagrange relations in one fitting procedure. You might want to ask, why modeling contemporaneous and Lagrange together? A simple answer is that you have a more complete picture of the temporal dynamics compared to only modeling either one of them. To be more specific, if we don't model the Lagrange relations, we might miss the common cause. For example, here, this one node is influencing 2 other nodes from t-1 to t. If we don't model the Lagrange relation, but only focus on the contemporaneous, we will see a contemporaneous relation between those 2. But we're missing out the information that because of this node, they're co-varying within the same measurement. So that'll be incorrect inference. On the other hand, if we don't model the contemporaneous relation, we might miss useful information. Especially in this type of exploratory analysis, we do not know the true time scale of the temporal dynamics. So if the time scale is faster than second by second, the temporal relation will show up in the contemporaneous relations. And if we don't model them, we will miss out the useful information. And this problem is especially prominent in EMA studies because there are often hours between 2 measurements in EMA studies, and there could be psychological behaviors or activities happening between those measurements that'll show up in the contemporaneous relations. So that being said, I will focus on this equation which contains all the temporal dynamics. And I want to reiterate what this equation means. In this equation, eta means the components in the system that includes delta SEL, delta RSA, and delta distress. And A and phi matrices are the temporal relations or contemporaneous versus Lagrange relations. And these matrices mean how variables or components influence each other within the same time point or across time points. And zeta are simply the noise coming into the system. So if this is the first time you have seen this form of equations, I don't want you to be intimidated. So I want to draw a connection with linear regression. In linear regression, we have this format. And linear regression's job is to figure out the relation between the outcome y and a bunch of predictors x using beta or estimating beta. And in dynamical system models, it's not that different. We have a bunch of variables as the outcome. So e to t here are the 3 components. The difference between dynamical system models and linear regression is that the predictors are the same outcome variables at t and t-1. So by doing that, we're not changing the statistical estimation. We're just shifting the focus of estimating the temporal relations. So here we're estimating how y are associated with x. And in this equation, we're estimating how variables are associated with each other across different time points or within the same time points. So with that being said, I hope at the conceptual level, you understand a little bit better how dynamical system works, how dynamical system methods work. And hopefully you will be able to feel a little bit more familiar with this type of method. So I want to unpack now how this equation looks like in the algebra form, because that'll be determining how we understand the network. So here, eta is a 3×1 vector that has delta SCL at time t, delta RSA at time t, and delta distress at time t. And A and phi here are 3×3 matrices that represent the contemporaneous and the Lagrange relations. And if we only look at row 1, that we can understand after these matrices are estimated, we can understand which components influence delta SCL. For example, if we multiply the first row and this column and add this row, multiplying this row and this column, we'll get this equation. And we'll see that delta SCL at time t is influenced by itself at t-1 and the other two components at t-1. Now that is rather complicated to do and understand. To have a more intuitive view of the temporal dynamics, we can translate that into a network diagram. So here you see 3 circles or 3 nodes that represent the 3 components in the emotion system. And there are arrows or edges that point from one to another to represent the temporal relations. So because the arrows are pointing into delta SCL, those arrows mean which components influence delta SCL at time t. And the green edges here represent positive temporal relations, and the dashed line represent Lagrange relations. So we see there are 3 dashed arrows pointing into delta SCL corresponding to the temporal relations in this equation. Similarly, we can look at the second row of the A and phi matrices and understand which components influence delta RSA. And we can also translate that into a network diagram. For example, the delta SCL is influencing delta RSA within the same measurement. So we're using a solid line to represent this contemporaneous relation. And also because it's a negative temporal relation, we're using the red color to indicate that. Very similarly, we can look at the third row to understand which components influence delta distress. And for this particular person, his or her distress is only affected by itself from the previous time point. So there is a self loop pointing to delta distress itself. And we can combine the 3 nodes together and the temporal relations or influence come into them together and have this complete picture of the temporal dynamics represented by a network. And I want to highlight here this negative temporal relation combined with this positive temporal relation is called a negative feedback loop. And that directly matches the definition of emotion regulation process in theory. And it functions as reducing changes in both of the nodes, which I will explain more momentarily. So once we can estimate every person's temporal dynamics, we can also depict every person's temporal dynamics as networks. And then it comes the joy of person-specific analysis, because each person has a very distinct network structure where sometimes they might be similar to each other. The question becomes, how do I quantify the differences across different networks so that I can understand emotion regulation? And I've come a long way since the first time I've estimated those networks to now that I have developed network metrics to understand them better. And I have tried network density metrics or node centrality metrics, and I will explain later why I landed on the impulse response analysis, which I think is a very intuitive way to understand dynamical system and also emotion regulation. So this technique is called impulse response analysis, and I use it to interpret the network structure. Here again, I want to draw a connection between the dynamical system model and linear regression. In linear regression, we interpret the beta by saying when there is 1 unit increase of x, there are beta units increase of y. In dynamical system models, it's not that different. We can convert A and phi, the contemporaneous and like-one relations, into this beta form, and then we give 1 unit increase to one of the variables at time t equals 1 and call it perturbation. And then because we know the temporal, we estimated the temporal relations, we can compute step by step how the variables will change their values over time. So I want to give you a visual to help you understand this. So if SCL receives a perturbation at time 1, we can compute step by step how it will change its value according to the temporal dynamics, because we have already estimated this. And then you will see the dynamical system, interestingly, will stabilize at a certain time point, and we can measure how far it has deviated, this value has deviated from its original starting point. And mathematically, that's called an equilibrium of the dynamical system. In this physiological context, I called it reactivity in the paper. And I want to highlight this is a network metric I developed because the computation of this reactivity score is solely based on the network information embedded in beta. And conceptually, I also want to help you understand what reactivity might mean in this emotion regulation context. So I often think about reactivity as if some kid is pushing another kid from his back, and it may take this kid 5 steps to restabilize. So the 5 steps is the reactivity, is an analog of the reactivity, is how far this kid has making an effort to restabilize itself from its original starting point. But on the other hand, if this same kid is pushing Ironman, it might take Ironman only 1 step or 0 step to restabilize himself, right? Because he's quite able to regulate his body. So this reactivity essentially, I'm trying to get at is that it means how well the system can regulate itself, either in terms of motor development or motor ability or emotion regulation ability. The further away the system is deviating from its original starting point after a perturbation, the less regulating ability this system has. And with that, I want to test if this really is the case according to the theory. So I want to ask the question, can reactivity really explain emotion regulation? So here I'm contrasting distinct emotion dynamics as mentioned before when I was talking about the theory. I have 2 networks depicted here. The top one is representing an emotion regulating dynamics because it has a negative feedback loop. So according to the theory, this constitutes emotion regulation or emotion regulating dynamics. And in the bottom network, it has a positive feedback loop. There are 2 positive temporal relations between delta SCL and delta RSA, and that constitutes an emotion generating dynamics. And I have kept all the edges with the same magnitude, just so you know. Only the sign of this temporal relation is opposite from the top network to the bottom network. And look at the impulse response analysis here. The top network, which is the emotion regulating dynamics, are producing a much lower reactivity score compared to this emotion generating dynamics. And I want to give you a quick view of why. Imagine we have an increase in delta SCL. This positive temporal relation will lead to an increase of delta RSA. And then in turn, this increase in delta RSA due to this negative temporal relation will lead to a decrease in delta SCL. That's why you see a dipping trend here in this impulse response analysis. And on the bottom network, if we have an increase of delta SCL, this positive temporal relation will lead to increase in delta RSA. And in turn, this increase in delta RSA due to this positive temporal relation will lead to even more increase in delta SCL. That's why you see this curve ramping up in the impulse response analysis. So That's why the negative feedback loop is producing a lower reactivity compared to the positive feedback loop. And as I mentioned earlier, I have tried many different network metrics. And by the current recommendation of computing network density in this body of literature, in the psychological network literature, the recommendation is compute density, network density, by taking the absolute sum of the weights. So the top network and the bottom network will have equal network density. However, they're very distinct in motion dynamics and have very different implications about how adolescents are, how their emotion system function in this kind of stressful task, right? So that's why I think the impulse response analysis has an advantage to explain how dynamical system models work and how the emotion regulation functions within a person. So here we come to a point that we want to see and test our hypothesis whether the reactivity can really explain anxiety, because remember we were expecting the emotion regulating dynamics for adolescents who have the emotion regulating dynamics estimated, we would expect them to be able to regulate their emotions in similar stressful tasks, and we would expect them to have lower level of anxiety. For adolescents who have emotion generating dynamics emerged in their system, we would expect them to feel more nervous in other similar stressful tasks, and therefore they're expected to have higher level of anxiety. So we're trying to link the reactivity produced by the person-specific network to the anxiety score at the person level. And what do we find? We found exactly the result that confirming our hypothesis. We found the reactivity of RSA, which is the network metric we developed, are positively associated with anxiety. So each data point here represents an adolescent. The x-axis represents the person-specific network metric of reactivity. The y-axis represents the person level of anxiety. So lower reactivity is associated with lower level of anxiety, and higher level reactivity associated with higher level of anxiety. To reinforce the idea, the higher end of the reactivity score are likely to be produced by emotion generating dynamics, and the lower end of reactivity are likely to be produced by emotion regulating dynamics. And we have our hypothesis confirmed that emotion regulating dynamics are associated with lower level of anxiety. Moreover, we even find this relation significant after controlling for more static and traditional measures of RSA, such as the baseline RSA or the change score of RSA. The change score is computed by taking the difference between the baseline and the task during the task mean level of RSA. So this really shows the advantage of this dynamical system method can tease out information, unique information about the system, and to explain individual differences in anxiety. So I want to come back to this slide to reiterate how this computational technique works. First, we have collected time series data. In this case, it's physiological response and cognitive experience second by second. And then we use dynamical system models to estimate the temporal relations and depict them as a network. And then we apply the impulse response analysis to interpret network structure or the individual differences in network structure, and develop a network metric called reactivity to measure how far the system has deviated from its original starting point. And eventually, empirically, we found an association between the network-based reactivity and anxiety. So that's how we can model the short-term emotion regulation dynamics as networks, develop network metric, and link that to slower timescale mental health outcomes. And this computational technique was also replicated using a different data set. In this paper, we were using ecological momentary assessment data, or EMA data. And in this paper, we had 13 variables of emotions, social behaviors, and thoughts. And I constructed a 13-node person-specific network and developed another network metric called recovery time, which measures from the time of perturbation to the time when the system first enters equilibrium. So essentially what that means is how quickly the system can regulate itself back to stability. And empirically, what we found is the recovery time of sadness is associated with the level of depressive symptoms. Conceptually, what it means is if it takes a person longer to recover from elevated sad mood, then this person is also more susceptible to develop higher level of depressive symptoms. And I want to highlight in this data set, we not only confirmed this in the between person sense, but also confirmed this in the within person sense. So for individuals who have longer recovery time, they're also more likely to have higher level of depressive symptoms. That's a between person sense. Within person sense means when a person has increase of recovery time of sadness, this person is also more likely to have increase of depressive symptoms. And I highlight this because I think it's a powerful conclusion to imply that we might be able to identify not only the person that is at risk of developing depression, but also the vulnerable period within the person that could develop depression. So with that being said, this is all I have to tell you about person-specific networks and how to tease out network metrics to evaluate emotion regulation. And I want to thank you for paying attention to this lecture.